Hey there, art nerds. Welcome back. It's great to see you. So today I have another watercolor art chat and tutorial for you guys, and I'm really excited about this one because I get to do some really fun and cool techniques, and I'm really looking forward to sharing them with you guys. So I have been sharing this piece on social media, and people seem to like it, so I can't wait to show you how I made it. So I'm starting today's art chat off with a penciled watercolor illustration. So this was penciled with an HB mechanical pencil. I prefer to use HB lead when I'm penciling my watercolor illustrations because softer leads have a tendency to the lead has a tendency to shift when you stretch your watercolor illustration, and to shift and to smudge and to look blurry and fuzzy when you use watercolor on top of it. HB is just hard enough that it's not going to move, but not so hard that it's super faint and hard to see, because as you go darker, or as you go softer with your leads, they have a tendency to go darker, and as you go harder with your leads, they have a tendency to go lighter. And I use the mechanical pencil for this because that's what I happen to use. I happen to prefer mechanical pencils. If you prefer wooden pencils, that's cool too. But as somebody with some hand issues and with some learning disabilities, I happen to really like mechanical pencils for my art and illustration. It's kind of whatever tools work for you are the best tools for the job. So to stretch my watercolor illustration, I am using plastic Gatorboard and blue painter's tape, as well as binder and Bulldog Clips. These are materials that I have used for a long time now, and they really get the job done, and they don't cost a whole lot of money. The only consumable is the blue painter's tape. I also use a hake brush, kind of a wide paintbrush with natural bristles, to stretch my watercolor paper, as well as a spray bottle of water. So this illustration is going to have some really dark shadows and some really bright lights, but I am starting this illustration by painting an overall toning wash of kind of a golden yellow, and then I'm also splattering in some more saturated yellow wet into wet. And I want this piece to feel magical, so I'm starting off with some ultramarine blue, I'm grabbing some cherry red, and I'm kind of painting it on top of our wash and on top of our yellows. I'm also adding in some hooker's green. So we're creating a colored underwash as well. And this is going to influence the colors that are going to go on top of it. I'm also adding in just a little bit of mauve here and there. Now, I've seen other artists use this technique, and I love how it looks when they use it. So I wanted to try it out myself, and I gotta say, I really liked how it turned out, and I want to try it again in the future. This is one of the things that I was really excited to share with you guys. Now, rather than masking off my Fireflies, at this point in time, I'm using a clean Viva paper towel to just kind of pick up the excess water and paint from the illustration. And this is a softer transition than if I were to paint in masking fluid and then remove it. But I am going to use a bit of masking fluid later on. Once that had a chance to dry, I am adding in some more saturated yellow to create the light from the Fireflies. So I've pulled out my masking fluid, and I am applying it with a synthetic watercolor brush. I'm using Winsor & Newton's removable masking fluid, the kind that has a little bit of yellow tinting in it. And I apologize if you hear cat noises in the background. Dax and Bowie are playing, which is impressive because Bowie hasn't really gotten along well with Dax until now, and I don't want to kick him out or chase him out of the room. So you guys might hear meowing or the jingle jangle of little kitten cat bells, and that would be Bowie and Dax playing in the background. So I applied a liberal amount of brush soap to my synthetic watercolor brush, and I'm using this with the brush soap still in it to apply my masking fluid to my illustration. And today I am painting on Canson's Moulin cold pressed cotton rag watercolor paper. I'm painting on a paper that can take a lot of water, a lot of working, a lot of layers. It's a great paper, not difficult to work with at all. The only problem is it can be difficult to find, but Jackson's carries it if you'd like to give it a try. And after that has had a chance to dry, I'm going in and I applied a wash of mauve, purple, and some black to the background, and I'm kind of feathering it in now with some clean water, and this is going to create kind of the atmosphere where everything takes place. And I have pulled out my granulating Daniel Smith watercolors. You guys have seen me talk about them in a couple of live streams. I even swatched them for you guys. I'm using Lunar Violet, which is violet with PBK 11, a super granulating black. I'm using Moon Glow, which is a violet that also has some green granulation, and I'm also using some PBK black or Lunar Black for that additional granulation, because I find that in an illustration like this one, that black granulation kind of creates this soft, almost velvety darkness. Now, Kara and Tanner are laying in the tall grass, and I will get to painting grass a little bit later on, but I want to do a lot of my establishing work and toning work early on to kind of set the scene and to kind of create the mood. And I really want this illustration to have a magical feel, evocative of the first time I ever saw fireflies in real life. So I'm going in and kind of reestablishing those blues, those reds, those greens, those mauves, and those yellows. Now, this isn't going to be super standout. You're really not going to notice it all that much in the finished piece. It's just meant to influence the colors that are painted on top of it. Also flicking in more of the purple while it's still a little bit wet so that it's not such a clear-cut delineation. It's not so straightforward. Things kind of blend into each other. As I'm working on this piece, I'm also going to add in additional layers of masking fluid once all my layers have dried, and this is going to create different layers of glow. Some of them are going to appear to be more in the background, some of them are going to appear to be fainter, because those will have been masked off once more under layers have been painted in. I'm also spritzing in, flicking in some masking fluid as well, so we get some randomized dots. I also wanted to paint in a little bit more yellow to really influence that yellow glow from the fireflies and to really kind of set the tone and set the mood. So to start painting the grass, I'm actually kind of creating the shadows or the darker tones of the grass, and I'm using phthalo blue for this. And I'm also using it to start blocking out the grass from Kara and Tanner, who are laying in the grass. And I'm really relying on my brush stroke here, particularly as it feathers into the head. I'm trying to leave that a little bit lighter. This is going to make painting the whole illustration a lot easier because it's going to be easier to delineate one form from another as I'm painting. I am referencing the original sketch on my computer while I'm painting this, since some areas do get a little bit more difficult to see because of the lunar black that's on top of them. It just kind of obscures my original pencil sketch. Now, I'm not aiming for exactitude with this except on the faces. That's always kind of important. I'm really aiming for capturing the feeling and the mood. So I'm going to change a few things from the sketch. My goal isn't for it to look exactly like the sketch except colorized, but it is helpful to have that reference there so that I don't miss any important parts. Now if you're new here, if this is your first art chat with me, hi, hello, welcome. I hope you guys will stick around and enjoy what you see. I'm Becca. I'm a watercolor comic artist and illustrator, and my main work that I'd love for you guys to check out is my watercolor webcomic 7-inch Cara. You can read it for totally freezies at 7inchcara.com, or if you're a fan of the dead tree format and you like to hoard books like me, if you were a dragon and your hoard would be books, you can purchase Volume 1 and Volume 2 through the Natto shop, and that's going to be linked in the description below. If you are on a budget and you can't afford to purchase a book, another great way you can support my work would be to fill out a library request form at your local library and request that they carry 7-inch Cara Volume 1 and 2. I get to see a book sale, you get to read 7-inch Cara, you get to introduce new people to 7-inch Cara, which I super duper appreciate, and more people get to find out about the work that I'm working on. And as an independently publishing creator, as a small business and somebody who is telling her own tales and publishing her own stories, that is one of the best ways you can help me out. And if you're already a fan of 7-inch Cara, it would really mean the world to me. It would be such a huge help if you took a moment and you left a review on Amazon or on Goodreads. That is one of the best ways you can help me out, and it's just absolutely irreplaceable. So once I blocked in the background in phthalo blue, I'm starting to paint in the shadows using a grisé technique where I'm kind of underpainting the shadows using that same phthalo blue. This is going to be the main shadows that I use in this illustration. I'm not going to do too much contrast color shadows for this. I'm really going to rely on those phthalo and indigo blue shadows. And I'm using Holbein's phthalo blue and mixing in indigo as I need darker, more nuanced colors. And I'm going to give this a few passes because this is my opportunity to really start delineating the forms, defining the forms, and to create the atmosphere. I want my characters to look and feel like they're inhabiting the environment that I'm painting them in. And a great way to do that is to allow the local color of what's around them, in this instance grass, to influence the shadows that are actually on their clothes and on their bodies. So since grass has kind of a greenish undertone, a blue-greenish undertone, I'm going to use phthalo blue to create the shadows on them, and that's also going to help create this kind of nighttime atmosphere. Now, this is where I really felt like the illustration was starting to look kind of magical. We have that colorful underwash, we've got the blue shadows, and we've got the yellow lighting. And there's something that I really like about the ideas going on here. There's something that I really would like to explore in a future watercolor piece and just kind of leave it at that. Do most of my rendering with that underwash, with those yellows, and with those blue shadows, because I think there's some magic, and I think the finished piece still retains a lot of that magic, but it also loses a lot because I kind of cover up what's really working for it. So I would love to revisit the techniques that I used here, especially as you guys see it developing in this instance where it really starts to feel like a magical moment, like a galaxy moment almost. I really want to revisit those at a later time and just kind of see if I can't create a piece focusing mainly on that and not pushing it too far out of that realm. So next I want to start painting the grass itself, and for that I'm using Daniel Smith's Undersea Green. This is a beautiful granulating green that has a wide range of shading capabilities. There's some olive green in there, there's some hooker's green in there, there's some indigo in there, there's even some brown in there. It makes for a really beautiful color that has a lot of complexity and depth. Now, Daniel Smith isn't the only company that makes these beautiful super granulating watercolors. I've actually talked about several of them here on the channel. I've talked about Roman Schmal's Aquarius. They've got some beautiful granulating colors, including their own version of Undersea Green, which would be Aquarius Green. And I've also talked about Supervision's CAAM super granulating watercolors here on the channel. I haven't had a chance to play with them quite as much as I'd like. I haven't had a chance to really push their possibilities, but I have tried them out for comic backgrounds, and I think they could be a great addition to any watercolor artist, any watercolor comic artist palette. So if you guys think that's interesting, if you guys are intrigued with super granulating colors, because there are some gorgeous super granulating colors that can really help you capture some beautiful beautiful effects. I hope you guys will check those reviews out. So for the most part with this illustration, I am relying heavily at this stage on my brush stroke. That's brush work. That's one of the ways that I really handle grass, is letting the brush itself do the work. And for this illustration, I am mainly using silver black velvet watercolor brushes. Now, these are synthetic and natural brushes, and they kind of have the best traits of both at a more affordable price point than say a Klinsky sable brush or a really good squirrel brush would have. So if you're on the market for good watercolor brushes, I highly recommend Silver Black Velvet. If they were to ever approach me and want to do a sponsorship or a deal or a collaboration, I would say yes in a minute, because I paint with these brushes basically every day. Now, once my first layer of green had a chance to dry, I'm going in with masking fluid and a synthetic brush, and I'm masking off some areas in the grass. I'm masking off some of the clover, I'm masking off some of the highlights, because this is going to allow me to reserve those areas, and it's also going to allow me to save the highlights, but I can paint very quickly because I'm not trying to work around that, and I don't have to think about those or remember them as I'm doing subsequent layers. I'm also splattering in some more masking fluid as well as dotting in some more masking fluid, because I'm really trying to create these layers of glow and these layers of depth. And I love how that underwash looks with those multicolors. It's just beautiful. I can't wait to revisit this technique because it really is cool. And I'd really like to see how a piece that I don't add all these layers of local color on top of would look to completion. So once my masking fluid dried, I'm going in with a thicker saturation of our Undersea Green. Now, as it's approaching Kara and Tanner's head, as it approaches the glow effect from our Fireflies, I'm kind of tapering it off, and in some instances I'm going to go in with a brush of clean water and soften that transition so it's a softer glow. But as it goes towards their legs and other areas that don't have as much glow, that don't have as many Fireflies, it's just going to go straight up to the edge of the leg or the edge of the boot or whatever object it's kind of encountering. We have two types of grass here. We have the grass that is standing up around them. They are Lilliputian. They're only about 7 inches tall. So this is regular grass that you might see in your backyard. And one of the things I really like about using the Lilliputian world as my setting is it's a chance to change people's perspective, to change how they see the everyday world, and hopefully to spark their imaginations. We're taking objects that people see all the time, that they might take for granted, that they might even overlook and ignore, and putting them in a different context, changing how they are interacted with and how they affect the world that these characters inhabit. And hopefully that gets people to look at the world around them with a new appreciation. So for this example here, we've got all this tall grass. This is the same kind of grass that would be in your backyard. You probably see this kind of grass every day in your yard, in the parks, just growing randomly in between the cracks of the sidewalks, and you probably don't really think a whole lot about it. But for Kara, this big expanse of grass is an opportunity for adventure and for danger and to discover new things. So that's one of the reasons I create most of the work I create in this, reimagined scale of the world at a Lilliputian scale, because it's just fun to reimagine the world we see every day and we take for granted with fresh eyes. I created a frame of grass around the characters. Now I'm going in with that same phthalo blue, and I am just kind of refining the shadows and creating more depth on the grass that they're laying on, and the grass as it kind of comes closer and starts to interact with them. I'm using a smaller black velvet brush now. So for the most part, when I'm doing watercolor illustration, I'm primarily painting with watercolor rounds, unless I'm looking for a special effect or unless I'm covering a large area with something. And generally I like to work with softer watercolor rounds because I do a lot of glazes and I'm not looking to scrub up or disrupt the paint that's already on the paper. Now that I've got a baseline for the background started, I can start painting in the local color on Cara and Tanner. And I'm starting with kind of my default Caucasian skin tone, mixing yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet. Now, generally, I like to use kind of contrasting or complementary colors to do the shadows. It kind of depends on what I'm painting. Like on skin tones, I will usually go with like a red violet, depending on the skin tone itself. In this illustration though, I'm really not going to do that. I'm really going to rely on that phthalo blue underpainting that I did to convey the shadow, and that's gonna make them feel more like they actually belong in this environment, like they're actually part of this environment, because that's my other big goal here, is to create characters that look like they belong in the environments that I've painted. So that's one of the reasons I went ahead and I established a lot of the background first. It's often easier for me to paint the characters to fit the background I've already created than it is for me to paint a background that fits the characters that I've created. So the techniques that I'm going to use to paint Cara and Tanner are pretty straightforward. They're the same sort of techniques that I use whenever I'm painting people. It's just going to be a lot of filling in the color and then glazing local color on top of it, doing a little bit less each layer. And generally I like to kind of work on everything all at the same time, try to build everything up at the same time. So I might do like a layer of skin, and then while that's drying I might paint the buttons on the pants, since they're not likely to be touching any of the skin and it's not likely to cause any sort of bleeding. So I like to paint non-adjacent objects, non-adjacent subjects, kind of one after each other, and that way once I've kind of finished the last one, I can go back in and paint something new. It does, as long as I'm painting in an environment that isn't super high humidity, that isn't really super damp, I can kind of paint very quickly this way. And even though I live in Southeast Louisiana, which is a very, very humid and muggy place, generally the whole house dehumidifier I have does a good job of keeping up with the humidity between that and between the AC. But if things tend to get really, really wet, really soggy, and I'm having a lot of dry time issues, I'll also turn on the fan once the paper has absorbed some of that water, and the airflow really helps with it drying a little bit more quickly. I'm so sorry about that. I'm staying at my mom's house during the aftermath of Ida because most of the area I live in is without power, and her house has a generator, and she's got a faulty smoke detector that's dying. So I clipped as much of it as I still could. Otherwise I would have had to re-record that entire segment. And this is already the second time I'm recording this, because when I was screening the video the first time, when I thought I was totally done, I realized my microphone is starting to die on me. So things are not always super great. I'm gonna keep on trucking, but there are definitely areas of my life that are a bit of a struggle bus. So I really do appreciate all of the patience that you guys have with any peccadillos that might arise in the recording. And I hope that you guys will mostly focus on the art that I'm sharing with you and the information I'm trying to share with you guys, rather than any audio oddities. So since this is an art chat, and since I'm kind of demonstrating techniques that I've demonstrated in many other tutorials, I'm not going to focus on walking you guys step by step through my process of painting people. I've got a lot of great tutorials where I talk about that more in depth, and generally under better circumstances when I have internet and electricity, I love doing live streams where I get to hang out and answer y'all's questions. So if enough of you guys have watched those other tutorials and would like a walkthrough, I do not mind hanging out with y'all and painting with you guys and sharing my process with y'all. That is such a delightful way to spend a Friday evening. And my World Watercolor Month watercolor art chats, where I talk about my favorite papers and materials and techniques and all that kind of stuff, those are some of my favorite live streams, and y'all seem to really dig those too. So I'm really looking forward to when I have internet and electricity again and we can hang out again. But these art chats are kind of like that. We're separated by time. We're inhabiting two different times, but we're sharing a shared experience. So it's almost as cool, but honestly, the live streams and just hanging out with other artists in person and making art together is just so much more fulfilling because it's more of an immediate response rather than me creating something and sharing it and hoping y'all will like it and hoping it lands. Like, I would love to do more like art chats with you guys where I just share stories from my life, like share stories from years of doing conventions, because I've got some real humdinger stories, or share stories from teaching, or just share stories from art school. But it would be really helpful if I could see your reaction as I'm sharing it so I can tell whether or not y'all are actually digging those stories. Because in the past, I've shared stories from my life along with art. In fact, the Paper Children tutorials that I created in December, which also included like free printable paper children that you could color and assemble yourselves, those did horribly, and they were so much work, and it has me a little bit discouraged to do just like, you know, hang out with me, I'm gonna paint and tell you guys stories from my life. I'm like kind of building up courage to do that by doing these less formal art chats. So I am narrating this after Hurricane Ida, but I painted this the week before Hurricane Ida, right before we were supposed to move. So Joseph and I have recently purchased a house in Destrehan. It's our first house, and it's going to be our only house, I hope. I hope we're done. But before that, we were renting in this small town called Norco, about 10 minutes down the road. And we were, everything about buying a house in the year of 2021, the year of COVID, was super long. It took us 9 months to finally settle on a house and work everything out. And then we had to wait for them to finish moving out. And that took a lot longer than they expected and we expected. So we were kind of trying to hurry up and get our stuff moved into the new house before our rent rolled over. And I was trying to kind of finish up my backlog of tutorials and reviews that were like half done or on the burner. I was trying to finish up everything that was on stretcher boards because I know it's going to be a while from moving to when I can actually start recording again, because I want to do a lot in my new studio and it's going to require a lot of revision. So I knew I wouldn't necessarily have a workspace or the time to do that. So I wanted to get some stuff prepared for you guys. And then Ida hit halfway through our move and just totally derailed everything. And all of St. Charles Parish, which is on both sides of the Mississippi River and is like 10 small towns, is without electricity for like a month. Energy isn't going to have electricity up until like the end of September, and Ida hit at the beginning of September. Talk about a derailment. But I'm fortunate. I'm staying at my mom's house. She has electricity. I'm staying in my old bedroom, and there's actually enough room for me to set up a temporary workspace. And I am able to record some videos for you guys here, which is weird, but also nice. And it allows me to kind of fill in the gaps that I know are going to pop up as we're moving and my inability to create work in that time period and to be able to communicate with you guys. So I am both in a weird predicament and very, very fortunate. But if you guys check out my Twitter, I shared some shots of my new workspace, and it wasn't hard to set up, and it's not a particularly expensive workspace. The most important thing is having a white recording area and having a boatload of lights and having a recording arm. And I was able to use my Rode mic arm for this, and it's actually working out pretty well. Now, the only downside is her house does have electricity, so I have light. I have AC, which is more important than you'd think in Southeast Louisiana, and I have a humidifier in the room next to me. But everything is taking so long to dry because her house is really damp. So it's taking me a little bit longer to work on a piece than it normally would, especially because we're still doing debris cleanup. We recently finally finished the move from Norco to Melrose. We had to finish the last part of it up in car loads. We wanted to rent a U-Haul, but Ida had other plans. So it's definitely been kind of a struggle bus. It's been a challenge, but we're really fortunate because if you drive around St. Charles Parish, you'll notice that some areas got hit really bad, some houses got hit really bad, and some were relatively fortunate. And some people lost everything. The house we're staying in, not even a shingle off the roof. We were so lucky. The house we just bought had a tree fall on the garage, but none of the windows broke and there wasn't any major leaking. The house we were moving out of had nothing wrong with it other than not having water or electricity. So that's 3 houses. The odds were not in our favor. We were so fortunate. So now that I've finished painting most of the base colors for Kara and Tanner, and don't forget, check the description down below. I'm going to have links to other great tutorials, to other great playlists. If you want to hang out with me, you can totally just put those playlists on and I'll talk to you while you work on whatever you're working on. It's like we're hanging out, except during COVID. But I am going to start removing some of the masking fluid from my Fireflies here and there, and I'm going to start kind of underpainting them, painting the local color that they would be on top of. So for example, the one that I've already removed, I painted a little bit of Kara's skin tone under there, and that's just to create the effect of transparency, like you can kind of see through it. So one of the things about narrating in post is I have the benefit of hindsight. I know where I went wrong and I can see it coming, and that is both fun because I can kind of self-critique for you guys, and I can point out what I would do differently in the future, and it actually helps me improve my art. And it's also horrible because I can't stop myself from making those mistakes. It's like watching a train wreck, but you're also the conductor and you can see yourself driving off the cliff. So if I just start making incoherent, horrible noises, it's because I see the train wreck coming. But I promise, this piece ended up turning into something I really liked in the end. So just because I would do some things differently doesn't mean I'm not happy with the piece. It's just some areas of improvement that I would do differently in the future. I was so eager to dive into the really cool techniques that I was trying out at the beginning of the illustration that I really didn't have a chance to talk to you guys about the paints that I'm using. So I am using my Daily Driver watercolor palette, which is what I paint with. It's what I paint Kara pages with. It's what I paint most illustrations with. It's what I use all the time. And it is a rag bag of different professional paints that I've reviewed over the years and happen to really like. Most of the paints are tube watercolors that I've dried into half pans because I find that to be more economical. If you're interested in learning more about my Daily Driver palette, as well as a thought process behind it, I actually have an older art sound off, I believe, or it might have been a World Watercolor Month prompt where I talk about it in depth. So I'm going to link that for you guys down in the description. If you're curious, I hope you'll check it out. I'm always a big nerd when it comes to what other people are painting with and what they like. I always want to know, so I would be curious. So I shared it with you guys in case you guys are as well. I removed more of the masking fluid from the Fireflies so that I could underpaint more of them. And the first layer of underpainting actually looks pretty cool. It creates this translucency. It makes the Fireflies look like they belong in the environment. That's not the train wreck. That's not the big problem. And I used a masking fluid pickup to remove that masking fluid. Some people can use their fingers. Some people can use the back end of a brush. I have tried both. It does not work for me. It might work for you, but masking fluid pickups work well for me. And I find that they don't tend to tear the paper okay, so me using my fingers to try and remove the masking fluid almost always tears the paper because I think I work too hard at it. So if you have trouble with masking fluid, a masking fluid pickup might be a solution to your problems. While all that up at the top dries, I'm going to remove some of the splatter and speckles, what a tongue twister, down from the bottom and start rendering more of the details and cleaning up more of the details in the grass closest to the viewer. I've also got a spritzer bottle full of clean water, and I really want to kind of make the Fireflies look like they belong in this environment. Right now, or right before, they were too clean, they were too clear cut, so I spritzed them with water just to kind of encourage some color movement, some color migration, so that they look like they actually are influenced by the environment that's surrounding them. That is not the train going off the tracks. I actually like how that look. I'm also removing some of the masking fluid from the clovers that I painted, and I really like how that turned out. There's like, it's like they're catching the light from the Fireflies, and it really kind of creates more of a magical look. So this is what I mean by, I really like the underpainting techniques I used. I think that was really cool. I think that was really pretty, and I'd like to revisit that, but I don't think the end effect was bad or not what I was going for. It's more like I discovered something that looked really cool mid-process that I want to go back and refine and play around with. And that's one of the things I love about painting and trying new techniques, is when I discover midpoints that could be, with a little bit of work and a little bit of cleaning up, finished illustrations in and of themselves. It's so inspiring. It's like finding treasure. So for now, I'm kind of contemplating what I want to do next, where I want to render this next. So I'm going to kind of start rendering more of the grass. I'm using Hooker's Green for the lighter areas of the grass, the areas that are lit by the fireflies, and that kind of helps imply the lighting. And those of you who are very intrepid and were paying attention to what I was painting and not necessarily what I was saying when I was painting the characters, you will probably have noticed that I tried to leave a lot of glow effects, a lot of lighter areas where the firefly color might be influencing their clothing. And I did that using wet into wet blending technique, so we get this really nice soft diffused glow. So this is an area I'm still working on, I'm still studying, I'm still practicing, but I really love painting light and shadow, and that's an area I really want to get better at, and I really want to improve at painting light effects. Honestly, one of my end goals is to paint watercolor illustrations that in a way look digital, because when you're doing digital, you can do all these layer effects and you can do all these additional layers, and you can really mess around with how the layers interact with each other to create these really cool color schemes and lighting schemes. And that's much harder to do with traditional media. But that's one of my goals, is to get good enough with watercolor and play around with watercolor enough and practice with watercolor enough that I can actually get some really cool lighting schemes that otherwise, for me as an artist, would have only been possible for me to accomplish with digital media. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're trying to paint light or create the illusion of light is that for people to understand that light is light, you have to paint the shadow. If you have a white sheet of paper, your brain doesn't read that as light. It's just a neutral thing. But if you paint all of that sheet of paper black, except for a single circle in the middle, then your brain is going to immediately notice how bright the moon is on that sheet of paper. So in order to create the illusion of light, you also have to create the illusion of shadow and really get in there and create a lot of contrast. So that's what I'm trying to do here, really leaning heavily on indigo for that. And this is kind of where my train started to go off the rails, because for some reason I thought I really needed to do more underpainting with the fireflies. I really should have left them alone because they looked really good. And it gets worse, and I'll point that out as well, because one of the things about improving as an artist is the ability to look at your work and be able to self-critique. And for me, mid-process is really the best time to self-critique, because that's when I'm making all the decisions. That's when for the next piece, I might decide to skip a step or handle a step differently. End of the piece critique is useful as well, but it's not going to be as useful for refining technique as criticizing or being able to criticize your work as you're painting it. And for me, doing these narrated voiceovers on top of time-lapse watercolor illustrations actually provides me a great opportunity to critique my process and to critique my choices while I'm working on it, so the next piece I'm working on can be an improvement on the last. So if you feel like maybe you're kind of stagnating and you're not really sure why, a way you can remedy that is to record yourself working and review it later on. And I mean, to be real, y'all, I record all my tutorials using my phone. I have like a Galaxy, oh shoot, I don't know what it is. It's one of the newer ones. I upgraded because I do use my phone for literally everything. But I record with my phone. I used to record with my S7 and use that for videos. So while the video quality isn't as good as if I were using a dedicated camera, it does make recording and editing very accessible for somebody like me. I can edit my video in the bathtub if I want to, and that makes it something that I can actually do while making art. No. This is where the train goes off the tracks. This is where I'm kind of like, nah. So I wanted to kind of add back in that magical element that I really liked from early on, where we had the underpainting with the beautiful colors. And I was like, okay, a great way to reintroduce that magic would be to add it into the Fireflies glow. And it just muddies it. It just doesn't work as well as I'd hoped. If I wanted to do that, I should have gone in much darker in the early undertoning stages rather than trying to add that in later. The saving grace is I can lift some of that back up using clean water and a paper towel so it's not as noticeable. And as you guys can see, if you look closely, I actually left some much lighter rim lining around the outside, the perimeter of the Fireflies circular glows. Now, I do not know why my camera is struggling so much with focus right there, but I was basically just going in using indigo and adding in additional shadows. So this point is mostly about refining. I have the basics of the idea here. I have the basics of the color. I have the basics of the technique. I mean, some people would even call this done. It could be done. But at this point, I'm refining it. I've probably allowed it to dry for a while. I probably stepped away and had dinner, or maybe I watched a TV show, or I took a break of some sort. And I've come back, and now it's time to like clean things up, add in some details, add in some darker shadows, and try to refine things. So something I like to do is make chaos in the early stages, and you'll see that a lot in my more modern pieces, and then refine it. And I think it looks so cool when you have some chaos and some refinement. So I'm always trying to balance that messiness with very straightforward, mannered watercolor illustration. So one problem I think I have is I have a tendency to kind of over-render my work. And I actually think a lot of this stems from the fact that I'm ADHD, and that for most of my life, people accused me of not putting enough time and attention into things. So I overcompensate by way over-laboring and overworking some things and killing some of the fun aspects of my work. And at some point, I'd really like to start keeping a watercolor sketchbook where I do timed watercolor pieces, and when the timer stops, I gotta stop. And I think that would really teach me to edit and to cut steps that I don't really need, and to really get in there and tell the heart and story of what I'm trying to illustrate. That's definitely a someday thing for me. I'm just not in a routine right now where I could feasibly do that, but I do think that would really help me, and it would also probably teach me to tell stronger color stories where I'm not reliant on this big convenience palette, but I have a few colors that I just get in there and use to best effect. Because that's another thing, is I have a tendency of just going in with too many colors. And once the majority of my watercolor painting has dried, I'm able to go in with my masking fluid, frisk it, and pick up any additional speckles and spots, because I did just splatter it on there, so there's a lot of little bitty pieces that I've missed. And also go in with my watercolor pencils, which I talk about this in most of my watercolor art chats, but I'll talk about it here. I'm using Caran Museum Aquarelle, I'm using Derwent Inktense, and I am using Caran Supracolor 2. Those are my favorites. Sometimes I also use Faber-Castell's Albrecht Dürer. I did a bunch of watercolor pencil reviews in the past because I really wanted to figure out which which brands I like the best, which ones work the best for me. I wanted to share that information in case that would be helpful, useful, or informative for another artist. And those are the brands that I found that I like the best. They gave the best color payoff. They handled the best. They just did what I wanted them to do. Generally, when I'm using watercolor pencils, it's really just to add in my highlights, to add in my shadows, if I need to do a little bit of color correcting, and to add in some details that might be challenging for whatever reason, might be challenging to do with straight up watercolors and a tiny watercolor brush. At this stage, I'm going to go back and forth between watercolor pencils, watercolor, and a watercolor brush with clean water. I like using a watercolor brush with clean water because one of the beautiful things about watercolor pencils is you can actually kind of fade them out with clean water. And this is one of the reasons I try to push you guys, if and when possible and feasible, because cotton rag paper doesn't work for every illustration. I do still use cellulose paper quite frequently, but cotton rag paper is going to hold on to those pigments in a way that cellulose paper is not going to hold on to those pigments. So you really can do more with cotton rag paper, especially in terms of glazes and layering and toning washes and using your watercolor pencils. Right now, everything I'm doing is all in service to that sense of glow. I'm going in with bismuth yellow and I'm adding in some yellow highlights, some yellow rim lighting. I'm using my watercolor pencils to add in some yellow highlights. And I'm also using it's like a creamy sort of yellow color in the Museum Aquarelle line. I'm using that on top of the Fireflies to kind of push back all the colors that I added and kind of regretted, to kind of refocus the fact that these are glowing objects and that they're casting light, to make them appear a little bit more brighter and a little less translucent. I went a little too far with the translucency for this particular illustration. And then finally, I pull out my white gouache. I'm a big fan of Winsor Newton gouache, Blick gouache, Utrecht gouache, any of those. I don't really need the most expensive gouache. I also don't want the cheapest gouache. For those of you who aren't familiar with gouache, it's just an opaque watercolor, and it's just meant to be painted a little bit more thickly than watercolor. And you can do different effects with it and paint on different papers with it. I'm not really proficient with gouache. I love watercolor, but gouache is too much like acrylic for me in general. But I like using white gouache to add in highlights and to add in rim lighting and to kind of revise and fix a few things. So I'm also using my white watercolor pencil to add a little bit of surface design to Tanner's shirt. I'm doing a paisley, like it was a paisley handkerchief. And I start with my white watercolor pencil and then I go over it again with gouache. And I use the gouache for the highlights sort of, and I use the white watercolor pencil for the areas that would be more in shadow, so we actually get that contrast in color. And I'll just kind of blend the two out so it's a softer transition. This illustration was a lot of work. I painted it in about 4 days, which is actually pretty quick because there have been some illustrations I painted recently that were just like total slogs. I was so lost. But for this one, I had a really good idea of what I wanted, what techniques I wanted to try, and where I was going with this. So I really enjoyed the process of this illustration. I enjoyed painting it. I enjoyed pushing those glow effects, and I am enjoying the process of narrating it and sharing it with you guys. I really like how this piece turned out, and I'm really excited about the direction that my art's moving in. I really want to continue to push lighting effects and creating atmospheres and creating environments and characters that inhabit those environments, because when you tell stories about tiny people, the environment is one of the characters. It is a really important part of the story, and it's an environment that most people are familiar with, just imagined in a different light. If you happen to like my art and you'd like to see more of it, I regularly share my art over on Twitter at NatoSoup and over on Instagram. I also share my art over on Artstation at natosoup.artstation.com, as well as occasionally on Artfall. I would love it if you'd follow me and say hi to me on any of those platforms. So, you know, watercolor illustration is finished when it's time to remove the blue tape. I wait until everything is absolutely dry, and then I pull away my blue tape at a 90-degree angle. So if it does does tear, it doesn't tear into the illustration itself. It just tears into the white border. And there we have it, another watercolor illustration finished and another art chat and tutorial that I can share with you guys. I really enjoyed this one. There were a lot of really fun techniques that I want to revisit, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. It would really mean a lot to me if you let me know down in the comments below if you learned anything from this one, because it would just tell me that I did a good job. If you enjoyed it, it would also mean a lot to me if you left me a big ol' thumbs up. And if you're not yet subscribed, please take a moment, hit that subscribe button, and then click that bell notification so YouTube actually lets you know when the channel updates, because it doesn't let people know. If you miss my updates, if you find that you're not getting my updates, I share everything that went live once a week over on my Patreon. It's set to public so anybody can read it, and you can follow my patron for free. But if you want to help support the work that I do here on the channel, if you want to encourage me, if you want to enable me, if you want to support and sponsor, if you want to be a patron of my art, you can join me over at Patreon at patreon.com/nattosoup. Not only will you get early access to most of the content that I share here on the channel, but I also share my class materials, my printables, my presentations, and my handouts over there, as well as free coloring pages and whatever other goodies, I don't know why that's a tongue twister, whatever other goodies I think my patrons might be interested in. While we're still recovering from Ida and my internet access is limited, I am mostly just sharing early access videos, but once I get internet access again, I can't wait to share more with you guys. I had so much fun, like I said, painting this illustration and getting to share it with you guys. I hope y'all had fun hanging out with me today. It's my goal to help you guys make art a habit, because I think art should be something that anybody has access to, and I share my education and experience as freely as possible to help you guys make that a reality. So if I've helped you in your quest to pursue art, if I've made art just a little bit more accessible for you, please let me know that as well, because I get lonely, y'all, and it's nice to hear nice things sometimes. So I want to say a huge thank you to these amazing, phenomenal patrons. Thank you guys so much for your support over the years. It honestly means the world to me. If you guys would like to join their esteemed ranks, you can join me at patreon.com/nattosoup. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope you guys will check out these awesome videos and playlists. I think I've got something you'll find interesting. Bye, y'all.